Hello, dear listener. This is the State of White Supremacy, August 18th, 2019. The post today, there's a few news headlines that I want to go over, a few books that I want to make reference to that I've read over the past couple of weeks, and one that I'm still in the process of reading, and a TV series that I caught up on a little bit. I'm not completely caught up on it, but something I'd watched the first season a couple of years ago and decided to watch the second season recently just out of curiosity to see if there's anything in it that is revealing like the first season was about white supremacy. And um, to begin with, I just want to go over some couple of news. Over the past week, we're still in the aftermath of these mass shootings, and you have like the Dayton shooter's friend being revealed that his friend bought the gun and the body armor and the high capacity magazine, and like just the idea that someone could purchase a gun and body armor and high capacity magazines and not arouse any suspicion from people. What possible reason would somebody need to purchase body armor in this society? Like, again, this is the kind of world, the kind of universe, the kind of world that white people want to create, to where somebody could purchase these things and not arouse these. Why would somebody need a high capacity magazine? So I say regarding, like, because white people always want to give the impression that this easy accessibility of guns has to do with fighting the government, when in reality it has greater relation to something I'm going to talk about a little bit later, regarding needing to be prepared for anything or thinking the unthinkable. But why white people in this country are so obsessed with guns, apart from the extremely violent history of this country and the relation of firearms to being used to control and take things from non-white people. That all has a direct connection to it. But just European psychology, thinking the unthinkable, that's something they have to do in order to survive as a race, because they're a minority, because they're genetically deficient and can't survive in a world of equality. They need to be thinking the unthinkable, to be prepared for anything all the time. That's why you will never have, in the richest country in the world, the hub of white supremacy, you're not going to have any restrictions on white people's abilities to kill. So a guy can purchase a gun and body armor and high capacity magazine and not arouse any suspicion. And he lied on his application when he purchased his gun, saying that he had no drug offenses when he did, and yet he still got the gun. And that relation of the insanity of this system, to where people just even having a thorough background check is something they don't even want. Like, that's too much. You can't even have a background check where they actually verify the information. They're not in such a hurry to give you a gun. Whereas in this society, it's always suspicious about, regarding this society, the things that they're always in a hurry to give you versus the things that they never want to give you. Like, they're not in a hurry to give you a loan, for a business, or a loan for a house or something. But they're very much in a hurry to give you a loan for a school or something, a loan that you can never get rid of ever. People will be paying. So many people that student loans, they're gonna be paying it to the day they die, and that's why they're in a hurry to give you student loans. But other loans they don't want to give you. They want to get in a hurry to give you guns, but they don't want you to have health insurance. I say, in this society that is built on a hierarchy, the people at the bottom, or anybody who's not at the top of that hierarchy, is supposed to be disposable. So therefore, they should be in a position to be killed at any time. And the people who run the society accept that, and they get the people at the bottom of the society to accept it. And they get the people at the bottom to participate in it. Sometimes they get the people to put on uniforms, whether they're in the military or the police, and be involved in the mistreatment, because they're not rich. Cops aren't rich, but yet they are complicit in mistreating other people that aren't rich. But that's the way in a hierarchy. The rich people, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, are not involved directly in the violence towards the bottom part of the population. They just direct it, and they usually direct the murder with other people that are at the bottom of the population, recruiting poor people to do harm to other poor people. It's like when colonial powers go to other countries, they recruit from the native population and get them to mistreat the other natives. Like, that's just a routine practice of white supremacy. That's how a filthy rich guy like Donald Trump can wrap white trash folk that are not rich around his little finger. You know, that's why in this society, rich white people have always been able to do that in this society. It's like they see in the hierarchy, they might not be at the top of it, but they're not at the bottom. The niggers are at the bottom, so they just accept that. You know? And of course, there was another, arrest this week regarding someone who made threats about another mass shooting in Florida. That Richard Clayton, his name was, who posted on social media photos of himself, and they said they found like thousands of rounds at his home, and on social media he posted a photo of him of a man like covered with a Stars and Stripes bandana, holding like an AR-15 rifle and standing next to a banner with Trump's name on it. You know, and of course, it says a lot that, of course, Stars and Stripes, that once again, white supremacy is associated with patriotism. White supremacists in society, they associate, if you're a white supremacist, you're immediately a patriot. Like, what does Stars and Stripes have to do with being a terrorist and being a white supremacist? Immediately you're a patriot. You know. And another post he made was with a swastika and derogatory statements about Jews and black people. And it's like, oh, same guy who posts stuff with swastikas also posts Stars and Stripes stuff. And it's like, oh. Like I said, that's the psychology of white people in this society. Like I said, seeing the connections, the way these things, the contradictions. These people supposedly had ancestors who fought in a war against Nazis, and yet somehow in this society, they can associate Stars and Stripes and swastikas, and they don't see any contradiction in that. That's why over the past few months I've been reading books like, Hitler's American Friends and Hitler's American Model, audiobooks that I posted on my YouTube page, to show that how the white people in this country were not really against. They were not against white supremacy when they fought against the Nazis. They were just against those white supremacists not ruling. It was just a colonial war, just like World War I was. It was just white people fighting over power, fighting over territory. They weren't against white supremacy in and of itself. They just didn't want those white people to rule the world. They wanted to rule the world. Like the Civil War wasn't about white people being against white supremacy. Just these white people didn't want the white people in the North didn't want the white people in the South expanding slavery and taking over the whole country. That's what it was about. It wasn't about ending white supremacy. It's just not letting those white people take over, but still keeping white people at the top. You know? And of course, this week there was also read about a memorial for Emmett Till being desecrated by white students from University of Mississippi. With them like shooting the memorial and then taking like a photo next to it. Another instance of racist white youth. Something that really struck me when I first started studying racism, really, adamantly around like 2014, around when Eric Garner was murdered and Michael Brown was murdered, and the white response to those murders, and for looking at social media and observing the years that have been since regarding white adolescence and the way white people try to defend, write off, racism will die when these old white people die. And every day I see another instance of some adolescent white kids perpetuating everything that white people have said for centuries, showing that they're not ignorant and that black children are not going to have it easier dealing with white people than their ancestors, and black parents need to stop putting in their kids' mind that things are going to be better and that the white people you're dealing with are different than the white people that came before. You're dealing with the same people. It's another instance of when it comes to white terrorism, it doesn't end with your death as a black person. They can kill you, they can get away with killing you, and yet that's not the end of it. They murdered Emmett Till. They got away with murdering him. Nobody was punished, and yet that's not enough for white people. It's the same, that lynching mentality. It's like it's not enough to hang you, burn you, riddle your body with bullets. Then they got to cut off body parts as souvenirs to take home, take pictures. It's not enough just for you to be dead. They take a personal pride in it. That's a part of culture, white culture. And them, they didn't have a body for this, but just taking photos of themselves posing next to the memorial with Emmett Till's sign on, with Emmett Till's name on it with bullet holes in it. It's the same lynching mentality. And I saw, it was around like 2014, I started to notice instances of white adolescents posting like mocking lynch photos of themselves. Letting you know these people are not ignorant about their past. This is a tradition for white people, just like I said in a previous post regarding, the different wars and about how it's just a tradition for white people to, cut off body parts and keep them as souvenirs and take pictures, war after war, travesty after travesty. That I guarantee you could walk around to white people's homes today and still find remnants, souvenirs from lynchings, photo albums. White people are very traditional people. They love to keep trophies and stuff in their house. They are not. I guarantee if you did a thorough search in this society of white people's homes, you would find that stuff all over the place. I'm convinced of that, although I'm sure nobody will ever do it. And another instance in Mississippi, something that is associated with Mississippi this week, about a sheriff in Mississippi, Jim Johnson, having sent a text message claiming that a Hispanic lawmaker is worse than black people. Another instance of a white authority figure, sort of suggesting that black people are hard to please, that this Hispanic lawmaker is going to be worse than black people. Of another instance of white people in positions of authority singling out black people, always specifically. They're always very specific. In white politicians all over this country, they never say non-white people. They're always very specific in attacking exclusively black people. They always isolate us in their speech. They are not ignorant about the relationship that exists between white authority in the society and the black population. It doesn't matter if it's a judge. White judges know it's their job to ensure that black people feel the presence of this society. They know that is their job. And the hostility they show towards the black population all day, every day, just makes it so clear that it's like, and that's why I just laugh whenever people try to suggest that that you can reform these people when it is they're doing it. Their parents did it. They said to them it is a family tradition to see black people this way. That's what they have to in order to do their job. Is that you have to see black people this way. They're not victims of anything. It is beneficial to them. It is profitable to them, and it boosts their egos. They think more highly of themselves because seeing black people in this way it's an ego boost for white people. And of course, in relation to this story regarding the sheriff, the NAACP chapter of Mississippi just asked for an apology from the sheriff, which is just another instance of just reinforcing how worthless the NAACP is, and that is why the NAACP is still around. An apology? Really? Again, they don't do anything for black people. They don't build anything. They don't protect us from anything. They're just a protest organization, and that's why the NAACP is still around. They are worthless. Every black person in this country should be against the NAACP. They have done nothing for us. They are completely worthless. And I just cringe whenever I see their name in print because they don't do anything. Just a protest organization. And regarding white youth, there was also a story this week about a couple of Illinois high school graduates posting a video online talking about, black people, they smell, they don't work. We're going to bring back slavery to whip them niggers and bring back the KKK, white females, high school graduates. Another instance of white youth, how white people behave when there's no black people around. because that's not something that just slips off the tongue. That is how they really feel amongst themselves. And another instance this week of in Charlotte, there was a black county commissioners that were receiving letters, racist letters saying things like, each of you black Democrats should be tarred and feathered and run out of town, and none of you know how to speak properly, and do you think for 1 minute we will be inviting you to have dinner at our party, suggesting that white supremacists always think that black people want to be with them. Again, another remnant of the civil rights, the damage done by the civil rights movement. As if white people think that black people the integrationists just want to be with white people, so white people just assume that black people always want to be with them. And if you don't want to be with white people, then something is wrong with you. And they also posted stuff like, oh, you people don't even know how to use eating utensils and that kind of stuff. And the reason that these kind of stories I think is important, is that you never see any reversals of these kind of stories. You don't see white political figures being sent, threatening letters, attacking them, sent to them by black people. White authority figures insult the black population, and when black people have titles of authority in the society, the white civilian population attacks them. Black people are being attacked from all angles. You don't see white politicians and white people in positions of power being sent threatening letters, being insulted by black citizens. Just like you don't see black people in positions of power throwing insults at the white population of the society. There are no reversals in this behavior. That's why you should always scoff at deceptive people who try to give you the impression that racism is a two-way street. It's like someone who talks about there being multiple supremacies. They obviously don't know what the word supreme means. Supreme means, the most powerful. There can't be two supremes. There's no such thing as multiple supremacies. Racism is a one-way street. All this behavior that I'm talking about is specific to white people. You never heard of black people posing for photos, of dead white people. You never see any instances of black people damaging, mutilating some monument or memorial to some white person and taking pictures next to it. You don't see black police officers making derogatory comments about the white population. You never hear it. You never see it. It's like white men can stockpile firearms and buy guns and all stuff, and it doesn't arouse any suspicion, whereas every time a black person gets shot, a cop always says that they had a gun on them. A black person possessing a gun is a justification for murdering them, even in a society that makes guns so easy to purchase and talks so much about how we need guns. If a black person has a gun, it's a justification for them being murdered. But of course, the NRA doesn't have anything to say about that. That's what a contradiction. The society is saying that they associate that with America being America, that you're supposed to have the right to be able to defend yourself and have easy access to firearms. But then if the black person gets murdered by a cop, then them possibly having a firearm is a justification for them being murdered. Black people aren't supposed to have guns. Just the contradictions, that's why I say there are no reversals, of this behavior that I'm talking about on the part of white people. There's a lot of white behavior that we do imitate, particularly anti-black behavior, but we don't imitate white behavior regarding directing our hostility towards them. All of our hostility is directed inward. We imitate their anti-black behavior, but we don't imitate their behavior exactly like them, directing it towards them. Like I said last week, that's a product of self-hatred. Self-hatred takes the pain away from the source and directs it towards the victim rather than the victimizer. That's what self-hatred is all about. It protects the person that's dishing out the pain. That's all I have to say right now about the news this week. Last week I also talked about that book, Blood at the Root, of racial cleansing in America by Patrick Phillips. And I don't have much more to say about that, but considering that the amount of articles that are still being written endlessly about how Trump supporters are tired about being called racist, and I'm even hearing other, GOP senators and people that support Donald Trump being tired of being called racist and all that kind of stuff for supporting him. And it made me really think about that town that's depicted, or that county depicted in that book, Blood at the Root, regarding these racist whites ran all the black people out of the county. They threatened them. They vandalized people's property. Drive-by shootings into people's houses. They even at one point they sent like a couple of little white children to deliver an ultimatum to some black people, like little kids that are like 5 or 6 years old. They got pretty arrogant about it regarding giving black people like a certain amount of time where they had to get out of the county. You know, and after all, they ran all those black people out. They attacked any black person that came anywhere near the county for decades. And just in like the 1980s, like they nearly killed, like a black couple that came into near the county. The black male got shot like in the right behind the ear and nearly died, and a couple of white men went to jail for it. And after this happened, there were like some protests or some marches, like a couple of years later in that same county, and the people who lived in that county were throwing bottles and bricks and screaming, niggers go home and all that stuff. And the media caught wind of this, and this county was exposed, and these white people who lived in the county were so upset about how they were portrayed, and with a straight face talked about how they were portrayed inaccurately in the media and how they aren't really racist and all that kind of stuff. That's just, as I say, very few instances where white supremacists just cop to being white supremacists. Whenever they're exposed publicly, their instinct is always to deny it, because it doesn't help. That's what I say, like some blatant white supremacists have like tried to run for political office, people like David Duke, people, that are unapologetically white supremacists, but seldom is that the case. They're often denying it, That's why it's important to know all of the details, to know that that's just a characteristic of white supremacists. It does not matter how rabid a white supremacist they are. It does not matter. They will almost always deny it. And there's even instance of like of one of those white people in that town or that county being interviewed and talking about how he's not against black people, he's against niggers. And this is before that whole Chris Rock stand-up bit about black people and niggers. Something that when I was a kid it was funny, but as an adult I just cringe at the whole, at a black comedian, standing up in a room full of black people and white people talking about his black people and niggers, and I find it just appalling that I ever found that funny. And this white man, this was like in the 80s, I think it was, talking about how it's black people and this niggers, and when black people, keep to their own, but the niggers always want to be in here and mix, racially mix with other people and all that kind of stuff. And about how that's kind of funny, because that's the kind of guy that Marcus Garvey would have liked, because Marcus Garvey was for racial purity, and he was against any black people who wanted to be with white people. He wasn't about protesting. He was about us just keeping to ourselves, and that's why he met with KKK members and other white supremacist organizations who had the same agenda that he had. But problem is that by the time it gets to the 1980s, the Marcus Garvey philosophy of black nationalism is just completely gone, and integration has taken over completely, to where our only response to dealing with white supremacists is to protest and march and try to get them to change their attitudes. Because integrationism is all about trying to change other people's attitudes. Black nationalism is about us changing our attitudes, our minds, and being maximizing who we can be to our benefit, not trying to change other people. Well, that's what Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam was about. That's what Marcus Garvey was about. And it's just so depressing that it's just been completely lost on the black population, and nobody's preaching that now. It's all about just trying to change, being obsessed with feelings of white people and wanting them to change. The only thing that needs to change is our attitudes and accept that white people are what they are. This week I also read a book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's a very detailed accounting of the technological development that led up to the first atomic bombs being created and dropped. And it's one of those books. It gives you a great sort of idea about how real people in positions of power have to think the unthinkable. It's like what I said before about how whites obsess with firearms and military spending, and this is part of white psychology, is that they think the unthinkable. They're taking into account all that could possibly happen. And how their technological development as a race has always come, from exploiting other people. It's hard in this society, this world, the groups that are underdeveloped are the groups that have been driven into underdevelopment by European powers who came in and exploited the land and took the resources. And because it's hard to have technological development as a race when you don't have any money. You got to exploit people. The Europeans exploit people economically, build up a huge economic base, and then their technological advancement explodes, because you can't have technological development without economics to pay for it. That's why the poorest people in the world are the most underdeveloped people in the world technologically, and Europeans are dedicated to keeping particularly the darkest people of the world technologically underdeveloped. And in this book, they don't really devote much time to talking about the resources that led up to the atomic bomb being created, like where they came from. Like, they don't talk much about anything being stolen from the continent of Africa. Like, they talk more about just science, a lot of more like scientific talk. A lot of lingo that if you're not a nuclear scientist, you wouldn't even understand a lot of what's being said in it. And it talks about the political climate and regarding the development of the atomic bomb and what other nations were doing. It's mostly talk in relation to other countries apart from America. It talks mostly about Germany competing with America for the creation of the atomic bomb and trying to estimate how long it would take for them to create one, and how they seem to be thought of as the greatest competition to building one. And it also talks about the perceptions, particularly in the 1930s up to the 40s, the perceptions of Germans versus that of the Japanese in the war, and about how the Germans were seen as human beings while the Japanese were seen as fanatics and animals that wouldn't quit. Even though you had all these people, worshiping Adolf Hitler, the Germans weren't seen as fanatical as the Japanese were. Somehow it seems like non-white people are always seen as more fanatical, mostly because they're not white. They're always seen as being more alien than even the most fanatical white person. And the way they talk about like a Japanese soldier being riddled with bullets and just refusing to die and committing hara-kiri, not wanting them to be the ones who killed him, and the story kind of made me think of Michael Brown and how white people talked about him. How even Darren Wilson talked about Michael Brown before he killed him, about how he's just this relentless beast that just wouldn't die and all that kind of stuff. About how this is how white people perceive, non-white people, as just these relentless creatures. That's why when you see movies like Aliens or Starship Troopers, and when you're seeing like these relentless hordes, or Lord of the Rings regarding the orcs, these relentless hordes of creatures swarming to kill these white people, you know what those creatures represent. It's all a remnant of white psychology. And this book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, made me think a lot of John Dower's book, Cultures of War, which I read a few months back, which is a comparative study between Pearl Harbor, the atomic bombs being dropped, and the occupation of Japan in World War II, and a comparative study between that and 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, and the occupation of Iraq after that. It was a sort of comparative study between the two, because there was a lot of World War II lingo that was used by George W. Bush's administration to justify the war in Iraq. A lot of, referencing like the axis of evil was meant to be a reference to, the Axis powers during World War II. And a lot of interesting comparisons. And in reading that book, you'll see World War II in a totally different light regarding the bombing of civilians, because really realize the amount of time spent during World War II bombing civilian German and Japanese populations, not targeting military targets, bombing civilians deliberately. I mean, they referred to them as terror bombings. Because I remember reading a book of several years back called Destined to Witness, growing up black in Nazi Germany, and the author of that book describes the bombing of Hamburg, Germany, and how way he describes it in that book, it sounded like a nuclear bomb had gone off. It wasn't a whole one bomb that caused all that destruction, but they bombed the city so much that it was almost like a nuclear bomb had gone off, where tens of thousands of people were killed. Yeah. And the amount of time, and it reinforces, that war reinforces how the only winners hold war criminals accountable. Like if Germany had won World War II, then a lot of Americans probably would have been on trial for war crimes, but Americans are never held accountable for war crimes. Even the wars that we supposedly lose, like people might have said that we lost the Vietnam War, but the Americans didn't. Well, the Vietnamese didn't submit to the Americans, just like the Koreans didn't submit to the Americans in the Korean War, but that was thought of as a stalemate, whereas Vietnam was thought of as a failure because Americans basically were sent home with their tails between their legs. It wasn't really a victory for the Vietnamese people because the Americans were not held accountable for their war crimes. If the Vietnamese had won that war, a lot of Americans would have been on trial for war crimes after Vietnam. Just like all those Germans that were on trial for war crimes after World War II. But because Americans won World War II, nobody was on trial for war crimes on the American side or the British side, or any rapid bombing of civilians, flattening whole cities, killing all these people that were not military at all. Yeah. And the book, this Making the Atomic Bomb does have like first-hand accounts of the effects of the atomic bomb, really gruesome stuff about, like flesh hanging off of people's bodies and blackened, burned skin and hair, hairlessness and blood everywhere, and, people walking around holding body parts that had been blown off and eyes that had popped out of their head and all that kind of stuff. It kind of reminds me of similar imagery from, the Vietnam War, when the newsreel footage of like little children running around with their skin charred from napalm and all that stuff. Really gruesome imagery. Of course, I have a visual mind, so just reading the description of this stuff, it just really, I paint a picture of it. And it really made me think about, as a kid watching Terminator 2 when that nuclear bomb went off in that scene with Sarah Connor and all these people being incinerated and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I'm looking back at that movie, it kind of makes me cringe when I think of what white people have done, being that they're the only race that has ever dropped an atomic bomb on people, and yet they would make a movie, $100 million movie in Terminator 2, and in that movie make a black man the face of basically a nuclear holocaust that killed all these people. They made Dyson, Joe Morton, the black man, they blamed him for it. And you have this white woman chastising him for being irresponsible regarding this technology, which and in retrospect, when you know history, that kind of stuff just it stands out to you so much. How white people, only ones who've ever dropped nuclear bombs on people, and yet they make a movie, a big budget movie, blaming a black man for a nuclear holocaust that in the movie hasn't even happened yet, but she's blaming him. And this white woman, shot into his house and shot him and held his family at gunpoint. And I remember reading a book on framing blackness, a few years ago, where the author of that book is full of reviews of films centering on the black experience and sort of film criticism book. And the author talks about being in the theater watching Terminator 2 at that moment when Sarah Connor shoots her way into the Dyson's house and shoots him and points a gun at his wife and says, "Get on the floor, bitch," and how the audience was enjoying it, how the audience was almost cheering at this white woman pointing a gun at a black woman telling her to get on the floor, bitch. And I see that stuff differently now. I see that totally. I mean, I loved that movie when I was a kid, but now as an adult, I see a movie like Terminator 2 totally differently. When I understand racism, And of course, the James Cameron, this is the same guy that made True Lies right after that, another movie where I'm supposed to be afraid of some dark people having, nuclear weapons at their disposal. First they blame the black man for the nuclear holocaust, and now they have the, cliche Arab terrorists, comical terrorists, that I'm supposed to enjoy seeing them die because they're the ones who you really should be afraid of having atomic bombs. And basically, True Lies is like taking the Libyan terrorist stuff from Back to the Future and just extending it to a whole movie. Basically, that's what they did. I also read James Comey's book, A Higher Loyalty, just to see if there's any constructive information regarding his experience as FBI director for Bush and Obama, and then it ending with Donald Trump. And in the book itself, it's another book that has a very consistent portrayal of Donald Trump regarding how he speaks to the people around him. It's very consistent. I don't say anything to any books that have been written about Donald Trump that are not, sort of written by people who worship him, books that are written by people that actually are interested in truth at all, or not people that don't demonstrate just flat out hostility towards him, or people that don't worship him, people that are trying to be truthful. The books are pretty consistent regarding his attitudes and his way of speaking and his paranoia and his insecurities. It's a consistent thing in almost in every book that I've read about Donald Trump. Just the Michael Wolff books, or the Commander-in-Chief, or Omarosa's book, or Bob Woodward's book, or every book I've read that has any sort of sources that are near Donald Trump, people that have interacted with him, that don't worship him. They usually speak. Only book that I read that had a pretty nauseating sort of positive view of Donald Trump and just sort of sweep all his negative characteristics under the carpet was that Team of Vipers book written by Cliff Sims, because he was just a worshiper of Donald Trump and didn't speak truthfully about him at all. But this book, A Higher Loyalty, is a pretty accurate, consistent portrayal of Donald Trump. It's not like a written in like a nasty way. It's just a book that's just speaking honestly about how Donald Trump behaves, his security, his insecurities, his attitude, because in the book, Comey sort of compares Donald Trump to the mafia bosses that he dealt with when he was a prosecutor, because he talks early in the book about prosecuting mob bosses and the sort of obsession that the mob have with loyalty, and how Trump has that same sort of obsession, that he figures anybody around him that works for him should be loyal to him, And Comey's whole the crux of the book is him adamantly reinforcing that the FBI should be separate from politics, and that it's not the job of the FBI director to be friendly with the president or be loyal to the president, and how he felt that people misconceived his tenure as the FBI director, thinking that he was chummy with Donald Trump. Because Comey tries to come across in the book as very an unbiased lawman, disconnected from politics as the FBI director. I mean, he talks about his wife and daughter voted for Hillary Clinton, but he kept himself separate from all that he wasn't rooting for Clinton or Trump. He tries to come across like a decent, guy. He tries to. But he most reveals himself when talking about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI's past, and makes reference to the FBI's, he doesn't say the COINTEL program, but he makes reference to FBI's quote-unquote dark past, and like the surveillance that they were doing with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so this part of the book is most revealing because Comey only makes, the FBI did, surveillance on a lot of people, but Comey only makes reference to Dr. King. Once again, let's say white people's obsession with Dr. King, speaking as if Dr. King was the only black person that ever tried to help his race. You get the impression that he was the only person that was a black person that existed in the world in the 1960s. It always says to say that anytime a white person quotes Dr. King or makes reference to Dr. King, I always immediately just assume that they're a racist, speaking like he's the only, like this is the only black person you feel comfortable talking about. Like there's no other black people in history. You never heard of all of those people. You never heard any of. You never heard of the, because I know the COINTELPRO was he didn't bring up Fred Hampton or anybody else. He doesn't mention just Dr. King. That just irked me so much. And talking about reading the letter that Dr. King wrote while he was in a jail in Birmingham, and talking about this is something that he reads frequently and all that kind of stuff. Just this, it reveals so much to me about a white person when they just obsess over Dr. King, over a dead black person whose legacy they've manipulated so much and minimized so much and dumbed it down and use him against us. And this is the only person, they waged war against the whole race, but only want to make reference to Dr. King. That says so much about James Comey. And then when he gets into talking about the police shooting videos that's sparked so much of unrest over the past several years, and he talks about the killing of Michael Brown and the investigation that came afterwards, and he talks about he talks about the so-called FBI investigation that confirmed that Darren Wilson had been beaten up by Michael Brown, and Michael Brown tried to take his gun from him. And he sort of defends this on the part of the FBI that, basically saying that this is what happened, and Michael Brown, attacked him, tried to take the gun from him, and the FBI did their job. But of course, he doesn't explain why the killers of Eric Garner or Tamir Rice or John Crawford, why they got away with murder, when the murders are right there on camera and there's nothing to debate. But he doesn't explain that in the book. I mean, he even talks in the book about police shooting black people and cops getting shot as if they're equivalent, as if one happens as often as the other. Talks about that one instance in, I think it was in New York a few years back, when a couple of cops got shot and killed in their squad car, and tries to make it seem like it's some sort of parallel, like cops get shot nearly as much, every bit as much as they shoot black people, when it's not even close. But of course, we have to understand that he is defending his position in law enforcement. He's not going to someone who works in law enforcement is not going to speak honestly about the nature of law enforcement in this country. He's going to speak about the FBI like they're full of integrity and good guys, and you had one dark period in the past where they were investigating black people and trying to keep black people repressed. But the FBI doesn't do that now. That's the sentiment that comes from the book regarding his attitude, where he reveals himself. You know, where he claims that a spike in violence amongst black people that came about after those police shooting videos, when then in a lot of areas there was a spike in violence, where there seemed to be more black people being killed after the police videos occurred, and there was all this unrest, and saying that they had some connection to black people pulling away from law enforcement. That if black people went more towards law enforcement and didn't pull away from it, this violence wouldn't happen so much. And that this imagery of black people constantly seeing black people on video getting shot by cops had a connection to the spikes in violence amongst black people in these neighborhoods, when every white person knows that violence amongst black people, self-hatred, is what causes black people to kill each other rather than kill the people who they really want to kill. Like, if black people weren't so filled with self-hatred, every single cop that has been on a video murdering a black person would be dead. Darren Wilson would be dead. Daniel Pantaleo, who murdered Eric Garner, would be dead. All these white cops that have killed all these black people on video and went home and still getting paid to this day, living happy lives, would all be dead if black people were not filled with self-hatred. George Zimmerman would be dead if black people weren't so filled with self-hatred. And all white people know that. Only reason that black people do so much harm to each other and don't harm white people nearly as much as we should is self-hatred. People like James Comey, they understand our behavior. When they pretend like they do, but they have no interest in speaking honestly about why we behave the way we do. That's why, even though that movie wasn't good, but that Mandalay movie by Lars von Trier, that gets closer at the heart of how black people, how our way of thinking has been controlled by white people. There's more truth in that film than you see in most films about race. Even though the movie isn't good, there's more truth in that. It's a topic that usually is not broached at all in entertainment, regarding how white people manipulate our behavior. White people understand our behavior like a scientist understands the behavior of a lab rat in their lab. Because as I've heard even like Amos Wilson in the past talk about how basically the ghettos in this society are like black people are in cages like rats, and every aspect of our lives is controlled by the white people on the outside, just like the scientist controls the life of everything that a rat has in a cage. Every aspect of that rat's life, that scientist has control of, just like white people control every aspect of our lives. They control the food we get. They control our water. They can poison our water if they want to. They provide us jobs. They control our behavior. So it's complete nonsense for a white person to pretend like they don't understand why we behave the way we do. It is important that we behave a certain way for this social structure to be maintained. They're not ignorant about our behavior. They know for this whole society to be maintained, we have to be crazy, we have to be stupid, we have to be self-destructive, we have to be childlike. There can't be any black men, there can only be black boys. There can't be black women, there can only be black girls. Everybody has to be childish. You can't be concerned with serious things. World power. We can't be concerned. Power is not something that we are supposed to worry about. White people are supposed to worry about that kind of stuff. Our main priority is just getting a job working for white people. That's the sort of thinking that we're supposed to have. And all white people know that. And even though there might be some accuracies in this Higher Loyalty book by James Comey about Donald Trump, when he talks about black people, then he reveals himself. That's why I say it's important to read these books. Whenever black people become the topic of discussion, the white person always reveals who they really are. That's why there's not a white person on earth that I would be surprised to find out was a white supremacist. Not one in the history of the world. I also started reading Jim Crow's Children, a book written by Peter Irons about really about a historical record of cases over the decades that have dealt with school desegregation. A lot of talk of Thurgood Marshall's efforts and various stories about black people trying to help their children gain entry into white schools. Sometimes it's because that school was closest to their home and they didn't want to have to drive out of their way to take their kid to some crappy school that's further away, or the white schools had more resources and they even knew what to do with extra rooms and everything, and yet they still preferred they've made the black children crowd into these schools that were basically just shacks with benches for them to sit on, cast off books, where the children had to go and cut wood in the winter to keep the classroom partially warm, because all they had was like a stove where they could just throw wood in to keep the classroom warm, because they were just in a shack. And these crappy resources, and it talks about Kenneth Clark's doll test and how that was used to show the effects of segregation, and suggesting that black children low self-esteem came from being segregated from white people. And the ridiculous thing is that the idea that black self-respect or self-love can only come from being closer to white people. That's the thing that most irritates me about this whole approach that was taken by so many black people back then. Sort of the suggestion that us being closer, that a black child can only love themselves when they gain the love and affection of white children. Because this is a complete affront to black nationalism. And I'll say again how the integrationism pushed by groups like the NAACP, because there's a lot of talk of that NAACP in this book. Push is all about trying to gain entry into the white world and thinking that black people can have self-respect while being with white people, and rejecting the notion of us having things for ourselves, because segregation is about black people having lesser resources than white people, living a lower quality. It's not mere physical separation. It was black children, because it talks in the book about how black children, how much less money was spent on the education of individual black children than white children. It's about black children having a fraction of the resources white children have for the same things. That's what segregation is. As much, it's not just being physically separated. And the book sort of suggests that even if black children had the same resources as white children, merely being separated from them would have made these black children have an inferiority complex, which is totally ridiculous, and again a complete attack on black nationalism, suggesting that black people shouldn't want to be independent. We are the only people in the world that are encouraged to be dependent rather than independent. And how is being an independent, powerful race of people going to have you still feel inferior? Common sense lets all of us know that being with white people is what makes black people feel inferior. Because every time a black person is only allowed in the white world when they're in an inferior position. You're not allowed to be around white people unless you accept an inferior role. You can't be in a position of power, real power, in the white world. The inferiority complex doesn't just come from school. It comes from every aspect of life in this society. Black children turn on the TV, like Dr. Welsing will say, you turn on the television, all you see is white, 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 white. Everywhere you look in movies and television show, white people are the heroes. Black people, when this child looks in their actual life, or the black people living around them, and everybody's poor, everybody's living, not living the way they want to be living, struggling to get by, living in slums and ghettos, and psychologically just white, just beaten down, and because they're so beaten down and so desperate, often exploit and abuse each other. So of course, and if your perception of black people is that, and your perception of white people is them as Superman and heroes, and white women as being, Marilyn Monroe or Elizabeth Taylor, back then. If this is your perception of white people versus this negative perception of black people, of course you're going to feel inferior. It's not just one thing. It's the whole social structure. As long as black people live under the control of another people, you're always going to be inferior. It's not just schools. So to suggest that just being black children feel inferior because they're segregated from white children is nonsense. That's what it's so. Anytime I read about NAACP did a lot of work, to combat lynchings, which I don't attack them for that. Even though they did a lot of, investigative work and stuff to be admired, but they didn't. But NAACP has never presented answers to any problems. That's the main problem. That's why the organization is still around, because they don't present any solutions. The book also talks about the people who were, trying to desegregate these schools back then also spoke about segregation as if white children were just as harmed by it as black children, which is a routine thing when you read about racism written by black people back then. Is frequently, particularly when you're dealing with integrationists, they always try to make the white supremacists speak about the white supremacists as if they were just as much of a victim. You even have, I've read books where I've read black people speak about the enslavement of African people and talk about how slavery was just as damaging to white people as it was damaging to us. And this is an offensive notion, but it's something that's repeated a lot. Of course, this damage, they don't say exactly. They say that they don't talk about the wealth accumulation or the land gaining and all the benefits that white people have that allow them today to police the world with their drones and military hardware, and with a straight face talk about slavery or something was harmful to them, or segregation was harmful to white children. But again, this is the sort of insanity that why I'm so adamantly against integrationists and the whole ideology. Is that it is so backwards. It is not an ideology that functions from I'm for the black race and the survival of the black race, and I'm for black people and being powerful people that can ensure our own survival. That is not the perspective of the integrationists. The integrationist is just trying to appeal to white people, even to the point of pushing black children aside and saying that white children are just as much of a victims of segregation as black children. Even as black children are being made to go to school and being made to, basically living in and working in and being taught in an environment that is not worthy of a human being even being in. So I remember in the book, you talk about Thurgood Marshall being down there and being down in the deep south and eating an orange and seeing a black child looking at him. And then he, calls the kid over and gives the kid an orange, and the kid just bites right into the orange, doesn't even take the peeling off, like the kid had never even had an orange before. This wasn't in Africa, this was in America, of a child living that low a quality of life. And I guarantee those conditions have not improved to this day regarding the incredibly low quality of life that people endure, even in this kind of richest country in the world. So I don't want to hear nothing about no white children being victims as much as black children. Complete nonsense. But said the inferiority complex will always exist as long as we exist under the government of another group. This is what Marcus Garvey knew. Why he wasn't simply about us having power in America. He wanted us to go to Africa so we could have our own government. And this is why he and those white supremacists got along well, because the white supremacists that Marcus Garvey dealt with made it very clear that the government of America was a white man's government. This is a white man's civilization, and we can never achieve any real, power or self-respect living under another group's civilization. We needed our own civilization. Now, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey admired Booker T. Washington because he was all about, doing things for ourselves, about independence and about economic development. self-sufficiency. Now, Booker T. Washington at the time was chastised by some black people for being Uncle Tom because he was about acquiescing to white supremacists, not creating a fuss, not antagonizing white people, which Marcus Garvey was also about. He was not about antagonizing people, calling people names. I mean, if you read the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, there's very little, if any, reference to him speaking derogatory about white people. He speaks far more negatively about other black people than he does white people. Because he accepts that white people, we're dependent on them. They have all the power, so it doesn't help us to antagonize them. Of course, this is the sort of opposition to, NAACP was a protest organization which always got white people angry because they were always protesting things. But even NAACP was governed by white people, and that's why they only went so far. That's why they would just protest, but they wouldn't solve any problems. And W.B. Du Bois was seen more at the time as being more rebellious, more antagonistic. Seen white people were far less accepting of him than they were of Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington wasn't about upsetting white people. Now, I'm not sure if Booker T. Washington would have been for Marcus Garvey's plan of going back to Africa, because I haven't read a lot of books about Booker T. Washington, but I'm not aware of him having any master plan of us going back to Africa. No, he was about economic development here and about black people accepting a sort of second-class status in white society and not creating a fuss here and having our own economic institutions and all this. But I'm not sure if he was for us going to Africa. Of course, he and Marcus Garvey never actually met. He died before Marcus Garvey could meet him. So who knows? That might have been, that maybe they wouldn't have agreed on that point if Marcus Garvey talked about going back to Africa. Maybe that would have been the breaking point between the two, or maybe not. Because we can have as much economic development as we want in this society, but as long as white people are still on top of us, all that economic development can be taken away. It doesn't matter how well we do economically. It doesn't matter how many jobs we have. They own the military. They own the corporations. They can, as proven with Tulsa, Oklahoma, any economic development that we have can be taken away at the drop of a hat, because white people have the power to do that. Because no matter what money we have in this society under their government, they have more. They print the money. So there is no safety in just economic development. You have to have complete control over your way of life, and you can only do that when you have your own government. And that's what Marcus Garvey knew. I'm not sure if Booker T. Washington knew that, but that's what Garvey knew. And just in the logic of integrated schools, of black parents, some like black parents back during blatant segregated schools were in the same position as black people who shop nowadays and would sooner give their money to the nearby white store rather than have to drive further away to purchase things at the black-owned store. It's the same sort of logic of convenience, that black parents living closer to the segregated school and wanting their child to go to that school because it was closer, rather than have to go really far to the school for black children. That sort of sensibility seems, it's the same sort of mentality of convenience. That it was almost more about convenience than quality. Because nowadays that's often the case where, when people have a strong culture, then they will drive, as far as they have to give money to their own. It does not matter. But since we have been so deculturized by integrationism, black people were always more concerned with convenience than anything else. That whatever store is closest to us, which is usually the white-owned store, we'll give the money to that store rather than work hard to find black-owned establishments and give them our money. Because that's the sort of thing, only people with real culture, work hard to give money to their own. And that's the sort of a psychology we would have if we embraced, the nationalist sort of thinking. But again, that thinking has just been completely wiped from our consciousness. Well, I haven't finished this Jim Crow's Children book, but it is full of a lot of that kind of the, the sort of I should say, well, misguided integrationist thinking that I just really am done with is full of a lot of that stuff. And the book is written. Peter Irons is a white person, so you always have to take that into account too. Always take whenever you read something, always take into account the race of the person who's writing it. So that always keeps you on your toes regarding the agenda of the person who wrote it. But I'm not done with that book yet. I might have more to say about it on another post. Lastly, I said it was a TV series that I sort of caught up on, that I started watching in 2017 and hadn't watched it since. The Handmaid's Tale. I watched the first season in 2017, and just recently I watched the second season of it. I know the third season just finished. I haven't watched the third season yet, so I can only talk about what's occurred the first two seasons of the show. I just watched it out of curiosity back in 2017. Apparently, I had some downtime, and I'd heard about it, and I just watched it just out of curiosity, see if there was anything in it that was constructive or gave real insight into white supremacy. And I found a number of things watching it back in 2017, consistent with a lot of other things in entertainment at the time. All of the propaganda that's usually promoted in white entertainment, was in that show when I watched it the first time. Like, immediately you introduce this white woman with a black husband and a mixed race child, again, immediately. And then you throw in that she has a gay black female best friend. Again, another running thing in entertainment. These TV shows and movies that the black female, gay black females you see all over television now. Like I've said in the previous post about shows like that Supergirl TV show, where Jimmy Olsen's sister is gay, a gay black female, in the Billions TV show. And on top of being gay, but the cliche of the black best friend is such one of the greatest going cliches in entertainment, where every movie and TV show you see in this society, a white lead character always got to have a black best friend. When in reality, most white people don't even know any black people. And this sort of, again, but this is a product of the diversity quota, the fantasy that white people put out to hide you from the truth. Where in the past, this was not the case, where even though shows like Cheers or Murphy Brown or Seinfeld or Friends, these white people didn't speak amongst themselves how white people really speak, but the shows didn't throw in fake black friends just to make the show have diversity. Those characters in those shows wouldn't know any black people. Like a show like Seinfeld, those white people wouldn't know any black people. And even when those, and often amongst themselves, they never spoke about black people at all. They didn't speak about how white people really speak when there's no black people around. And the show always revealed itself whenever there was a black character in the show. On a show like Seinfeld, the show really revealed its real nature whenever a black person appeared. Like, they had an episode on the show when Elaine was dating a guy and they didn't know if he was black or white, and you had George Costanza saying, like, I don't think, when they're debating whether or not he's black or white, he's like, I don't think we should be talking about this. Complete nonsense, suggesting that white people don't talk about black people amongst themselves, that the black person has to be in their presence for them to talk. It's a complete opposition to what Dr. Welsing always said about how she's had conversations with white people where they said amongst themselves, when it's just white people around, they're always talking negatively about black people. But watching these TV shows, they give you the impression that when it's a bunch of white people around, they never talk about black people. But they didn't even though that was fake about all these shows, the shows didn't throw in obligatory black friends just to be there. The show was more accurate in the sense that it's just white people amongst themselves. Even a show like Married with Children, like they throw Al Bundy's character at that shoe store was the only time that they threw in. Every time he had help from somebody at the shoe store, they always had like brought in another black male character to help him at the shoe store. But there was no black character who was a principal character that was in every episode. The fake relationships because I said that it's not real. Most white people don't even know any black people, don't socialize with any black people. So therefore, these relationships seem so fake. Like, I don't know if it's the direction of these movies, these TV shows, where anytime they have these black people, they're supposedly all friendly with these white people, the relationships feel so fake. Like this Handmaid's Tale, this white woman, this relationship she had with this gay black female, it seems so fake. These people would not know each other. They would not be best friends. It is completely nonsense. It's completely fake, And it makes me think of this show that's airing right now, this 4 Weddings and a Funeral series. They've only aired like 6 episodes so far. I could go in on that show and do a whole post just about what I've observed of that horrific show. But that show reinforces again a fake black-white relationships, giving the impression that black people and white people are all friendly and known each other for years, and it's very dishonest regarding the dynamics. The actors don't feel like they know each other. It's just completely phony. And that really, really stands out to me when you watch TV shows where the relationships just feel just so fake. Even the relationship in The Handmaid's Tale with her and her black husband just feel fake. Just there so she can have a little brown baby. Because we all know how the fetish that white women have for little brown children. So they had to give her a non-white husband just for that. And the Handmaid's Tale, one of the things that really irritated me when I watched the show in 2017 was that it just seemed to be this fantasy, presenting this fantasy of black women and white women occupying the same place in a society. That black women and white women are both a part of some sisterhood of persecution, which was hilarious to me because it made me think of that movie I saw. The Keeping Room. It was 2014 when that movie came out, set in the slave South, and yet had white women, presented the notion that white women and black women were somehow in it together, being victimized by men. Complete nonsense. And they did the same thing in The Help too. I think, wasn't it The Help? They had like one of the white female characters had an abusive husband, and one of the black female characters also had an abusive husband, and gave the impression that they were all they were together in some sisterhood of being abused by men. Complete nonsense. Black women and white women do not occupy the same place in this society. That's what's really hard. It's so sad whenever white feminists get a hold of black women and give them the impression that they do occupy the same place in the society. When white women are against white men that are on top of everybody. So the idea of black women being against black men when black men are not on top of the society just makes it more clear what the agenda of those white women is, just to create conflict between black men and black women. And it stood to me on this show how there was sort of conflict between the black male husband of the lead character and her gay black female best friend, that they were always sort of antagonistic towards each other. At one point in the first season, I think she tells the man that he should, castrate himself or something like this. Just really, they don't come across like they don't like each other. Even though at the best moment in the first season was in the last episode where they haven't seen each other for a while, and you have the black male and the black female hugging each other and embracing each other and happy to see each other. That was the best part of the first season. Now, they're not a couple, but just the show was so full of unpleasantness, it's rare that you see any instance in a movie or television show of a black man and a black woman embracing each other, happy to see each other. This show deals mostly with the persecution of white women and homosexuals. That's something that really, because the show represents a white liberal worldview. Just say the white liberal feminist worldview. So the fact that it focuses almost exclusively on white women and homosexuals as the primary figures of persecution should tell you everything you need to know. The show almost completely ignores racism. There's almost no blatant references to racism. That makes the whole society feel very fake. Let's just say the whole situation of the show, the whole world that is established, this dystopian world, felt very fake to me. It wasn't believable to me from the moment I watched the show. It felt like some phony concoction from somebody that just wanted to create this fantasy of women, of white women being the victims in the society. And even though there are, in the background, you see some black characters. You might see some black men holding weapons as guards, or you might in the background see some black handmaids, maybe one or two, maybe in the background. But the principal characters are all white. The victims and then the victimizers are all mostly white. The ignoring of racism. And the fact that they made me feel like this society, I didn't understand how this society functioned. It felt just so phony regarding just because the show is sort of, and it's funny that it ignores racism because the whole structure of the show felt like it was modeled on 12 Years a Slave. Like they watched 12 Years a Slave and basically said, all right, the structure is going to be this guy going through this horrific experience, and every now and then we're going to cut back to his life before he was enslaved. And that's pretty much what they do in Handmaid's Tale. The show is full of frequent flashbacks to her life before she was made into a handmaid. Because basically the whole life of being a handmaid is presented like being in the big house on a slave plantation. That's basically what it is. The whole situation is meant to imitate being in the big house on a slave plantation. And one of the obvious things about the show is that it's something that could only be written by a white woman. The psychology of the show, with the whole story being about low birth rates being an issue, and needing use these women to ensure the biological survival of people. And it's something that could only be written by a white woman, you know. And it's interesting that the year I watched this show, that same year I watched when I had a lot of time off from work in 2017, and I binge watched a few shows. I mean, that same year is when I binge watched the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones when I had never seen it before. This is before the 7th season started. And that same year I watched Big Little Lies. I watched Top of the Lake, China Girl, another miniseries that also had Elizabeth Moss in it, who's the lead character of The Handmaid's Tale. And it really is strange because in that Top of the Lake China Girl series, that series dealt with white women and low birth rates and them using Asian females to have children for them. That was the whole plot of that series. So it's strange that Elizabeth Moss would be in that series and also be in this series. Because that had more closer to reality, though, because it was Asian females being used to have children for barren white women, whereas Handmaid's Tale is white women having children for other white women. So I say in 2017 there was definitely a sort of shift in entertainment regarding the white women. Let's just say with shows like Big Little Lies, white women being abused, and a sort of shift from them being abused to being empowered in a way. It's sort of went from a kind of different one fantasy to another fantasy, sort of persecution fantasy to another fantasy, because it went from shows like Top of the Lake China Girl and Big Little Lies, and then but also in that same year, the season 7 of Game of Thrones started, where we shifted over from white women primarily being the victimized the first few seasons of the show by Joffrey and Ramsay, and lots of violence towards women, rape and having wooden things crammed up, jammed up their rectums, and all sort of horrible stuff, and how women were being treated in the first run of the show. that it had a very strong sort of male perspective. We're getting lots of use, lots of women being referred to as whores and that kind of stuff. The very strong male perspective in early run of the show that I'm sure contributed to its popularity. And a lot of gratuitous female nudity in the early run of the show. When you notice the longer the show went on, by the time you got to the last season, there's hardly any nudity whatsoever. And in season 7, the women began to take over, and it became about, Cersei and Daenerys and them being in power, and the men sort of pushed into the background. And it switched over from a persecution fantasy to a power fantasy for white women. And to the point where all of a sudden now the white women are the ones to have the men executed and burned alive and tortured and all that kind of stuff. And it switched over. And of course that same year the Wonder Woman movie came out too. So it makes you feel like it's all felt like almost like a coordinated effort, because it was around the time of the whole Harvey Weinstein thing started and everything. That it felt almost like a coordinated effort on the part of white women. This sort of movement, particularly for white women, not black women. Because like I said, these shows, black women don't factor in any of these shows or movies. Listen, I say a persecution fantasy, because we all knew white people have a persecution complex. Even though they rule the world, they have a persecution complex. They always see themselves as the victims. And a show like The Handmaid's Tale is all a persecution fantasy. White people taking all the awful stuff they've done to other races and just putting themselves in the position that they're the ones being victimized. Reversing reality so that to justify them feeling how they already feel. Because it made me think of that movie several years back, the science fiction movie Battle Los Angeles. That was all about an alien menace occupying America, like a military occupation. And of course this movie comes out in the aftermath of America's occupation of Iraq during the Iraq War. So it's a sort of reversal, a sort of fantasy, reversing reality for the sake of fantasy to make people feel better about feeling how they already feel. That we're being attacked, we're under attack, so therefore our militaristic, jingoistic attitude is justified, so they create a fantasy like Battle Los Angeles, to assist that psychology. Reversing reality so you can be made to feel better, in fantasy. It's kind of like that awful John Travolta, Harry Belafonte movie that came out many years back, that White Man's Burden. That persecution fantasy, a world basically where it's people saying, in this world, the white people are the black people and the black people are the white people. Completely, just total nonsense. And it's A Handmaid's Tale is pretty much exactly like that, except it's for white women. A white woman persecution fantasy. White people playing the roles of the victims. Because we see white politicians always succeed in this society exploiting the victimhood of white citizens, giving white people the impression that things have been taken away from them and that they need to take it back, that they've been victimized and abused and exploited, and they're going to get everything back from exploiting the victimhood of white people. And it's always so bizarre in this society where white people run everything, that whenever there's a story about some oppression or rebellion, or some oppressive society, white people are always the heroes of the society. It's like the most popular, movies over the past, few decades about rebellions and uprisings, always white people leading the way. Whether it's Star Wars or The Matrix, even movies like Equilibrium, something like that. Well, anytime it's about some repressive regime and some uprising, white people always have to be the rebels. Only white people can be heroes as rebels in this society. Rebellious black people are fanaticals, terrorists. Even a movie like Nate Parker's The Birth of a Nation should have been all about a rebellion, but he lapsed more into the torture porn aspect of 12 Years a Slave and didn't devote enough time to the rebellion aspect. It came the closest, but you never see movies or TV shows about rebellions, revolutions, where a black person is the lead character and the black person is the hero. The black person is going to be the villain, like Killmonger in Black Panther, the villain. All reality always has to be reversed, in white entertainment. White people oppress people. They're not the oppressed. And yet, watching entertainment, you almost always think they're the ones in their fantasy, in their science fiction fantasy. They're always love to portray themselves as being oppressed, you know, and love it. It's fun for them, and white women as much as anybody. Yes, and that's why I came away with watching the first season of The Handmaid's Tale, of white female psychology, because that's what it mostly is about. The sort of psychology that I think the sort of psychology that kind of maybe irritated the people who were upset about the way Game of Thrones ended the past few couple of seasons when women took over the show, is that it seemed like the white feminist, seemed to have just consumed the show, and that irritated a lot of people. Because I say, when you watch movies and television, let's just say regarding all these movies about race over the past few years, they all feel like they're made by the same people, the same ideology, the integrationist ideology. When you watch all these movies or TV shows centering on white females, they all seem to, again, represent the same philosophy. The white feminists, they feel like they're all made by the same people. All the movies that have been made over the past 4 or 5 years centering on white females in fantasy or science fiction all feel like they're made by the same people. Same psychology, like they're trying to appeal to the same audience. Except some of them are in power, like I said, some of them are power fantasies, and some of them are persecution fantasies. And Handmaid's Tale, even into season 2, is still a persecution fantasy. Except season 2, at least at some point, they shifted over early on in an intercutting between the big house on the plantation, and you had the white female, the female gay character played by Alexis Bledel, who went basically to a concentration camp. So you're intercutting between white women in the big house on the plantation with white women in a concentration camp being worked to death. And even in that concentration camp, they had to have one black female there, all decayed, like she's rotting away. And her character dies, but her character has to be a homosexual and marry a white woman before she dies. Again, promoting the idea that the victims are women and homosexuals, and having a black female homosexual. And a black female homosexual with a white woman. It have to be with a white woman in the show. That's it, because in this show it is important to keep black people away from each other, black men and women away from each other, and pretty much black people in general away from each other. And of course, in the second season, a black male character assists Elizabeth Moss's character. Like he drops her off at like a warehouse and is going to leave her there, and she goes out and jumps in front of his truck and begs for him not to leave her there and take him with her, and he takes him back to her house. And of course, this black man also is married to a white woman and has a child that takes a liking to Elizabeth Moss's character. And of course, this black man who helps her, who didn't have to help her, that she urged him, begged him to help her, he helps her, but of course he gets killed for helping her. And the next time you see him, he's hanging by the neck, from a wall. And his family's been taken away from him. His white wife is gone, and his child's been taken away from him, and everything. And that's it. That's why you pay very close attention to every single depiction of black characters in these TV shows and movies. And of course, and in the second season, they reveal that Elizabeth Moss's husband, her black husband on the show, had previously been married to a black woman, and that they had been separated from each other, and that apparently had a falling out, and this black female chastises Elizabeth Moss for ruining her marriage and stealing her husband. And in response to that, the black husband is like, next time you see him, he's yelling into the phone at his former black wife's her voicemail. He's yelling and screaming and angry that she would talk badly to this white woman, and then he goes to make sure to tell this white woman that he loved her way more than he ever loved that black woman. He didn't say more than he loved her more than he loved that black woman, but he said he loved her way more than he ever loved his other wife. And it sort of presents the notion of sort of, again, this white woman being made to look like she's a victim, like she's being blamed for everything that she didn't have anything to do with. And of course, the image of this black man giving up. Let's say that that's about the only reference to a black male and a black female having a relationship in the run of the show is a failed marriage. And of course, they brought back the gay black best friend. And of course, gratuitously, for no reason whatsoever, even she has a sexual encounter in the second season with a white woman. And they imply that she had a love affair with another white woman who died, and you see her crying and moaning over the death of this other white woman. Because apparently, in this universe of this show, black men and black women only have interest in white women. That's only, that it doesn't matter if you're a black male or a black female, you're only interested in white women. I mean, it is nauseating. That's what I say. And even the gay black female in this show, at one point in the second season, they showed that she had had a child and gave that child away to white people. And later in the season, early in the run of the show, in the first season, it begins with Elizabeth Moss's character having her brown child taken away from her. And it's all, most of the show is about her trying to get back to that child. In the second season, she's reunited with that child for a moment, and then the child is taken away from her again. A lot of crying and sobbing, and which to me is vile, considering that one of the main practices of white people in the system of white supremacy is taking children away from black people. Separating black people from them, taking their children away. White women are the ones who are usually taking people's children away from them. And yet, with a straight face, you're going to have a TV show where I'm expected to feel sorry for some white woman having her brown child taken away from her. And crying and all that stuff. Like, they're the ones who break up black families. They're the ones who bred us like cattle and sold our children away. And yet I'm supposed to feel sorry for some white woman. I mean, it is. But again, it makes white people feel so good, to see themselves. I'm amazed in the run of the show that they didn't make the black people the ones who were the ones in charge, and the black people were the ones breeding, having white people have their children from them. I'm amazed white people didn't do that, go full reversal in that way. But maybe for them it would have been too obvious if they did that. Just having white people as the victims was enough. But even though they didn't do that, every time you see a black person on the screen, they make it very clear the hostility they have towards black people, how they want to keep black men and women away from each other. And there's even a point in the show when Elizabeth Moss's character, when she finds out that her black husband and her gay black best friend are both in Canada together, her response is, "Ooh, they're going to kill each other." It's meant to be a joke, but again, like I said, they established early in the show that these two characters, personality-wise, don't like each other. They have to make it clear that black men and women are not supposed to get along. That's just sort of the joke. Because they have to have the gay black female, behave in a really masculine way too. But her whole being homosexual, is so pointless in the run of the show, being that the show, Alexis Bledel's character is already a homosexual on the show. And she was probably more of a principal character in the first season than the best friend character. So why did they need two homosexuals? It's like the only reason that they made the black female gay was that she wouldn't be a sexual competitor for the black husband with Elizabeth Moss. If she's gay, then there's no way she's going to take her husband away from her. It's a way of desexualizing her, as a competitor, so they made her gay. Because otherwise, there's no reason for her character to be gay, other than just to make the black. It's like those old Hollywood movies when they would make sure that try to make the white woman look as beautiful as possible. They would only cast, a really fat black woman to play the maid next to her. You have the white woman looking all skinny, like Vivian Leigh in Gone with the Wind, and they have to cast, a fat black woman next to her, thinking that that's going to make this white woman look even better. They would never cast a really gorgeous black woman to put her next to a white woman, because that would diminish the white woman. The white women don't like competition. There's no reason why that black woman on this show had to be gay. But her victimhood can't be associated with her being black, so they still had to make her gay. They make her a victim of being gay. You know, I say in the show, people are only victimized in the show for being women or for being gay. And that part of that persecution fantasy is in this world that women aren't allowed to read. You know, and in the second season, they drive that home more, where you have the white woman, the madam of the house, the Yvonne Strahovski's character, attempting to give women the right to read, and she reads from the Bible and ends up getting a finger cut off for doing so. And of course, in American slavery was known as a peculiar institution because making laws for against slaves being able to read was something peculiar to American slavery. So to put that into a movie and to have a white woman have a finger cut off for trying to read, just really drives home how sadistic these people are regarding how obsessed with seeing themselves as victims, even if they have to take directly what they've done to other people and use that as a fantasy for themselves. And yet even this white woman who is victimized for trying to read, or earlier in the season she's whipped for forging letters when her husband was incapacitated, and he whips her to discipline her for that. And yet you're still meant to, she's done so much horrible stuff in the run of the show. And I mean, at a point in the second season where she holds down a pregnant woman while her husband rapes her. And yet at the end of the season, you're still supposed to feel sorry for her, for being a woman, for having her finger cut off, for trying to read, for being abused, for being a woman trying to read. You're meant to feel sorry for her, even though she's done all this horrible stuff in the run of the show. Because her character is more forceful than the male character. At least most of the run of the series, Yvonne Strahovski's character has been more forceful than the commander of the house. She pushes him into doing things like she's the one who encourages her husband to rape the pregnant woman. She encouraged it. He didn't want to do it. She encouraged him to do it and held her down. And yet, in early, they have earlier in the season where they flash back to her being shot, and her husband is like trying to comfort her, and she's like, man up, grow a pair, don't just mope like a child. And her saying that causes him to go out and find the person that shot her and shoot his wife. He didn't do it on his own initiative. She had to, encourage him to do it. That's the whole run of the show, that the white women have to show more presence than the men do. That's a sort of a running thing that I've noticed in recent entertainment. Whenever a female is the lead character of the show or the movie, how the men are portrayed in a more sort of passive manner. I mean, of course, very few instances in the run of The Handmaid's Tale where the men are the ones showing initiative and doing things without being pushed by the women. Very few instances regarding the individual characters in the show. As I said, like the man of the house on the show often is doing things behind his wife's back. Like he sets up a meeting between Elizabeth Moss and her daughter behind his wife's back. He's doing things behind his back. He's not flaunting his power in front of his white wife. And I said, it stands out to me because, like 10, 15 years ago, when I started binge watching all these movies I'd never seen before, particularly, and I looked at like movies from the 1970s, what really stood out to me was how men were portrayed in movies in the 1970s. How overt the misogyny was, how there was just sort of a shamelessness regarding the men were unapologetically men. They didn't try to come across sensitive, characters portrayed by people like Jack Nicholson or Gene Hackman. The overt, the machismo was so blatant that it was always presenting the male perspective. Very seldom did you get the female perspective of things. That the men they didn't care about something looking quote unquote politically correct, or offending people. Like the racism was overt, but the misogyny was just as overt. It's like just like I said before about how rampant sexual violence was in movies in the 70s. But a lead character could just slap a woman around, and yet you're still expected to be on the side of the man, even if he's abusive. Yeah, and that's the sort of characters you don't see in movies today. You don't see movies where the main character is a misogynist or abusive, and yet you're still supposed to be on his side. You know. As I said, that's what he said. This annoyed people even about a show like Game of Thrones. Is how early in the run of the show, the men were in charge, and then all these male characters that were in charge or in the foreground at the beginning of the show were gradually pushed into the background. Like the first few seasons, Tyrion was my favorite character on Game of Thrones. But then after he killed his father and left King's Landing, he became a supporting character in Daenerys' storyline, and his character. I lost interest in him after that. His character wasn't interesting anymore. And the same thing happened with Jon Snow in season 7, where he became a supporting character in Daenerys' storyline. In season 8, he did almost nothing in season 8, apart from killing Daenerys. He didn't do anything. I mean, think of like the Battle of Winterfell, where you have the Hound, this big, strong guy, and yet he was like cowering like a child. Like he was like a coward. And Arya was braver than him. I mean, even the little girl who killed the giant, who stabbed the giant in the eye with the dragon glass, the little girl who died, she was braver than the Hound in Game of Thrones in season 8. The little girl. As I say, all the men were sort of made into these sort of passive or just emasculated supporting figures, while the women were up front in charge and shown as being more tough. I'm sure that annoyed a lot of guys. When that's something that I've noticed in so much entertainment over the past few years. I think I probably first noticed it with The Force Awakens, that Star Wars with this exaggerated Daisy Ridley white female character, and how they had to emasculate all the men around her. I mean, you already have old Harrison Ford. Like, he's just old. He's not even a factor. It's almost a cameo, him being in the movie. But like John Boyega's character couldn't be a stormtrooper and be a real, a guy who had an experience, fighting and killing, because otherwise he'd be a real threat to her. They had to make him a janitor and emasculate him and make him into a clown so he wouldn't be threatening to her. The same they did with Kylo Ren, where Kylo Ren should have been the scariest character of all the Star Wars movies because he's a Skywalker. And there are no Jedis around to oppose him. He should have been scarier than Darth Vader was. He's young, he's a Skywalker. There are no Jedis around to oppose him because Luke ran off. He should be the scariest character of all these movies, but instead they turned him into a petulant child who throws tantrums. All to make Daisy Ridley look better. And I noticed that even before the Wonder Woman movie came out, the moment I knew Chris Pine was cast in it, I knew it was going to be the same thing. That they were going to cast this guy who had boyish looks, so he wouldn't be as much of a threat to Wonder Woman. Rather than cast a chiseled-jawed, more masculine, grizzled-looking guy to play that part, they cast, the guy with boyish looks who's not going to be a threat. Well, had they cast a harder-looking guy that had a more overbearing masculine presence, that would have been greater opposition to Wonder Woman, and it would have created more drama. And him changing would have made the movie better. But instead, his character doesn't change very much. He doesn't go from being a tough guy with a sort of casual disregard for the female perspective to being more open-minded guy. He's the same guy he was at the beginning of the movie. That would have created more drama if his character was more antagonistic towards the female. But in this day and age, the men can't be that way. The men have to be more passive. The men are just in the background. Like that Supergirl show is the same thing regarding Jimmy Olsen, or even the Martian Manhunter, who carries the facade of being a black man. They're always in the background, not doing anything, don't factor into anything. Let's just say all this entertainment all represents white female psychology specifically, white feminist psychology. And I'll guarantee you the Harriet Tubman movie that comes out is gonna emphasize her womanhood more than her blackness. You know, to appeal to the integrationist and the white establishment, I guarantee the movie will focus more on her womanhood than it will on her blackness and her fighting to help black people. Her womanhood will be more the focus. You know, that's why it's important. All this entertainment to always keep in mind that white supremacy is a war on nature. Racism is a war on nature. It's a war against the natural order of things, where the vast majority of the people, natural people of the earth, have to be on the oppression of an albino mutant minority and die in larger numbers and have access to lesser resources. All reality in the system of white supremacy has to be reversed to preserve white life. That is what white supremacy is. That's what racism is. There is no other racism right now. So the only value that comes from watching a show like Handmaid's Tale is that it gives you greater insight into the psychology of these so-called white liberal, white feminists, people that you think of as your white allies. Watch these shows and you see how these people really feel about you. It's easy to attack, Trump supporters and their less refined racist views. But shows like Handmaid's Tale and all this other entertainment depicting white female heroism reveal the other side and how they feel about us. Like, I haven't seen Captain Marvel, but in that movie, from what I hear, that they have a black female friend for her character in that movie too. So if you think Marvel has changed its attitudes post Black Panther, you're wrong. Like, all the Marvel characters before Black Panther, all these white heroes all had black sidekicks, and after Black Panther, the same thing. In Spider-Man Homecoming, he has a sidekick, not a black one, but a non-white one. And a mixed race girlfriend or whatever. Like, all of it, these people, it's consistent across the board, these people. So it's like, you have to connect the dots, and you realize when you will greater understand the people that you're dealing with. Not attempt to change the people, but in understanding them, we can understand ourselves better. That's why it's important to come to conclusions about the people that we have to deal with. And therefore, when you come to those conclusions about them, then you will stop trying to do things that are not achievable. You will stop trying to change their attitudes, stop trying to help them, and do what we need to do for ourselves. That's the main benefit of absorbing entertainment. Like a show like Handmaid's Tale. It's not a good show, and I wouldn't recommend it as entertainment. I could recommend it as something you could study. If you have the time to do it, something to watch and look at it with a very critical eye. But entertainment-wise, no, it's not. It's not pleasant to watch. It's like every other TV show. It drags itself out because it's based on a novel, but they're just like all these TV shows. Television is all about stretching things out, and they stretched it out for 3 seasons now. I don't know how much longer they're gonna stretch it out, but if you have the time, there is something in it that is revealing about white supremacy. I don't look at it as entertainment. I didn't look at Game of Thrones as entertainment. I don't look at any of these TV shows now, any of these movies as entertainment. I look at it as for what it tells me about the people behind it. That is the benefit of watching this stuff. I look at it as an analyst, because we all need to be analysts. We all need to be students to understand the world better. And we as black people need to devote more time to understanding the world around us better if we're going to improve our situation in this world and realize who our enemies are. That's all I have to say right now. Thanks for listening. I'll try to, my schedule is going to change. I'm starting a new job soon, so I probably won't have another post next Sunday. It might be a couple of weeks before I get settled to post something else. We'll see, but hopefully I'll have some other constructive information to get out to you. If you found this post constructive, please let me know. If it's something that you didn't like or something that I didn't make reference to, please let me know too. Comment, constructive comments. not just attacks. Social media. I'm not even on Facebook anymore because I found Facebook so non-constructive. I got off of Facebook, and now I'm just posting stuff on YouTube. So um, I don't mind feedback, but as long as it's constructive feedback. Thanks for listening.